begins in 1652 when the Dutch East India Company established a small refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. Jan van Riebeek and his settlers were not there to colonize an entire continent. They simply needed fresh water and vegetables for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. But the station grew. Dutch farmers, later called Boers, moved inland to graze cattle and grow crops. They brought enslaved people from Madagascar, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, and over generations mixed with local Khoisan populations. By the late 1700s, a distinct frontier society had emerged. The settlers spoke a new language that would become Afrikaans, and they saw themselves as a chosen people in a harsh land. They also developed a racial worldview that placed white Christians at the top, mixed race and African servants in the middle, and indigenous Khoisan and later Bantu-speaking groups at the bottom. When Britain seized the Cape Colony in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars, they brought their own ideas of racial hierarchy, but also a missionary movement that preached equality before God. Tensions between British authorities and Boer farmers grew, especially after Britain abolished slavery across its empire in 1834. In the 1830s and 1840s, thousands of Boer families left the Cape in what they called the Great Trek, establishing independent republics in the interior, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, later known as the Transvaal. For decades, these Boer republics and the British colonies coexisted uneasily, separated by vast distances and different visions of society. Everything changed in the second half of the 19th century with two discoveries that transformed South Africa forever. In 1867, diamonds were found near Kimberley. In 1886, gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand. Suddenly, the region mattered to the world. Hundreds of thousands of people, black laborers from across southern Africa, white prospectors, Indian traders, and British investors poured in. The deep-level gold mines required a large, cheap, controlled workforce. Mine owners and the colonial state worked together to create systems that would later feed directly into apartheid. African workers were housed in closed compounds, paid low wages, and prevented from moving freely with pass laws. The 1913 Natives Land Act, passed 3 years after the four colonies united to form the Union of South Africa in 1910, reserved 87% of the land for white ownership and forced many black farmers into overcrowded reserves or migrant labor. Segregation was not yet called apartheid, but the building blocks were there: separate living areas, restrictions on movement, different legal rights based on race, and an economy that depended on black labor while denying black people political power. After the Union of South Africa was created in 1910, English speakers dominated business and government. Many Afrikaners, descendants of the original Dutch, German, and French settlers, remained poor farmers or urban workers. The Anglo-Boer War of 1899-1902, in which Britain crushed the Boer republics and placed tens of thousands of Afrikaner women and children in concentration camps, left a lasting trauma. In the 1930s and 1940s, a new generation of Afrikaner intellectuals, clergy, and politicians began organizing. They created cultural organizations, trade unions, and a political party, the National Party, that spoke directly to Afrikaner identity and economic grievance. They argued that white civilization in South Africa could only survive if Afrikaners controlled the state, and that the growing urban black population posed an existential threat. World War II sharpened these divisions. Many Afrikaners sympathized with Nazi Germany or remained neutral. Prime Minister Jan Smuts supported Britain. When the war ended in 1945, poor white Afrikaners, still recovering from the Great Depression, moved to cities in large numbers and competed with black workers for jobs. In May 1948, the National Party, led by Daniel Francois Milan, won a surprise victory in an all-white election. Their platform was simple and direct: apartheid. They promised to protect white, and especially Afrikaner, jobs, culture, and safety by introducing total racial separation. Within months, the new government began passing the laws that would define apartheid for the next 4 decades. The Population Registration Act of 1950 classified every South African by race: white, colored, Indian, or native, later Bantu. The Group Areas Act of 1950 assigned different residential and business areas to different racial groups, leading to forced removals of hundreds of thousands of people. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act made it legal to have separate, and almost always unequal, beaches, buses, schools, and hospitals. Interracial marriage was banned in 1949, and sexual relations across the color line were criminalized in 1950. Past laws were tightened so that Black South Africans had to carry identity documents at all times. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 created a separate and deliberately inferior education system for Black children, designed, in the words of architect Hendrik Verwoerd, to prepare them for lives as laborers, not leaders. By the mid-1950s, the framework of Grand Apartheid was in place. The vision was no longer just segregation, but the creation of separate homelands where Black South Africans would supposedly exercise political rights while remaining foreign guest workers in the South Africa where they were born. Apartheid did not appear overnight in 1948. It was the result of 3 centuries of colonial expansion, frontier violence, British and Boer racial policies, and an industrial economy built on racial exploitation. The National Party simply took existing practices, gave them a name, and turned them into a comprehensive legal system enforced by one of the most powerful state bureaucracies in Africa. Understanding how South Africa became an apartheid state matters because it shows how ordinary policies, land acts, labor regulations, residential zoning can accumulate over generations and eventually produce a society structured entirely around race. And it reminds us that even the most entrenched systems, as South Africans would prove decades later, are not eternal.